Trump is guilty. The media is freaking out. It seems like maybe the liberals have finally won. Also, none of it matters. Now that might sound cynical, and of course it does feel like a big deal that Trump is the first president in history to be convicted of a criminal felony.
What the hell's happening?
Now if you'll excuse me, I am late for my community service.
But as we're gonna show you in this video, presidents doing illegal stuff isn't the exception. It's actually sort of the norm. And a certain type of illegality is baked into the very office of the presidency.
Necessary to such activity, this operation is deemed important to the national security of the United States.
So today, we're gonna ask, is it possible that all presidents already exist outside of the law? And what if Trump is an anomaly less for doing a crime than for actually facing consequences?
You do have to hand it to him. No president has ever been convicted more than Donald Trump. How long before he starts bragging about this?
We're gonna look at the history and then see how philosophers like Giorgio Agamben can help us make sense of why so many presidents act like they're exempt from following the law. But before we go on, we want to thank this video sponsor, BetterHelp. If you've experienced anxiety or depression, or just felt overwhelmed lately, BetterHelp is a resource that can help you feel better. I've talked about this before. I go to therapy, not afraid to say it, because I've struggled with depression for a long time. Going to therapy is great. Shouts to my therapist. But BetterHelp's network of more than 30,000 therapists are ready to listen to and help you. Now, after you take a brief questionnaire, you'll be matched with a therapist whose expertise fits your unique needs. Thanks to BetterHelp's remote model, you can work with a therapist whose skills might not be available in your area. You can message your therapist at any time, and you're going to receive timely and thoughtful responses. Plus, you can schedule your choice of phone or video sessions to receive counseling in real time. Now, in the event that you and your therapist aren't really a perfect match, don't worry about it. You can switch to a new one really easy for no additional charge. So join the more than 2 million people who have taken charge of their mental health with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/wisecrack, or you can just click the link in the video description. When you do, you'll get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/wisecrack. Now let's get back to learning about the goodness of the presidency. Now, Trump has actually inherited a time-honored tradition.
You really saying that in certain situations, the president can decide whether it's in the best interests of the nation and then do something illegal?
I'm saying that when the president does it, that means it's not illegal.
You likely know about the Watergate break-in.
And I think, too, that I could say that I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
And Bill Clinton getting dome in an oval.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
You also likely know about George W. Bush's passion for extra-legal enhanced interrogation, which is fancy speak for torture.
Why is waterboarding legal, in your opinion?
Because the lawyer said it was legal.
Or Barack Obama's penchant for droning civilians. It's time that we can say Obama did bad stuff. Doesn't it feel good? We just get it off our chest. Obama, he did some bad stuff. But the very first president to flout the law was George Washington. Now, he's lauded for establishing the basic norms of the presidency, for putting ideals over a lust for power, and for being America's first major real estate mogul. Washington was cash poor, but held massive amounts of land, some of which was stolen from fellow veterans of the French and Indian War, and much of the rest of it was acquired illegally on land King George III had deemed off limits due to, it belonging to native people. Incidentally, after Washington was given the honor of choosing the spot of the US Capitol, he chose for it to be located a few miles from his own property, and then he raised rent on his tenants, citing the area's new development. So our first president was a landlord, which isn't illegal, but isn't the best. Let me know in the comments what you think of landlords, and if you think they should be illegal. Don't hold back. Use the full word count. Washington also exploited government resources. Though he refused a salary while leading the army in the Revolutionary War, he did ask for an expense account, which ended up costing the colonies many times more than a general's salary, equivalent to millions of dollars today. Much of it spent on fine foods, ice cream, and liquor, the last of which amounted to nearly $40,000 a month. When elected president, he again asked for an expense account, but was instead awarded a salary by lawmakers who didn't want to get burned again. While president, Washington got creative when it came to following a Pennsylvania law that freed enslaved people after 6 months of bondage. So twice a year, president and his wife would secretly spirit their most valued slaves to a different state, resetting the clock on their servitude. Guys, if you're not familiar with this, America has this guy's head on a mountain. Now, Washington wrote to a relative that I do not think they would be benefited by the change. Oh, you don't, George? God bless the founding fathers. Washington set plenty of precedents for the presidency, but he also set one of breaking or at least fudging laws that he found inconvenient. Now, in one case that feels oddly contemporary, after one of many romantic affairs left a paper trail of love letters that would have been great fodder for blackmail, Warren G. Harding got the Republican National Committee to pay his mistress a monthly stipend and send her on an expensive cruise to Asia during his presidential campaign. He did hush money to influence an election. That's to say nothing of his administration's massive corruption ring, but Harding wasn't the only president who caused problems with his hard-on. The FBI was called in to cover up JFK's affair with a German spy during the Cold War. Erasing evidence of JFK's impressive libido took the extensive use of public funds, public buildings, and public employees because, like all Irish American men, he was a god of sex. Sometimes presidents also do illegal stuff when they're not horny, like Lincoln, whose campaign staff printed counterfeit tickets to sneak his supporters into the Republican convention and nominate him. Though now most famous for his role in ending slavery, even he admitted to Congress that his acts as president during the Civil War were likely illegal. Most notable was his suspension of habeas corpus, which protects Americans from being detained without court or judge approval. This action empowered his State Department to use government agents and regular citizens to widely surveil the population and arbitrarily imprison 13,000 people, mostly for speaking out against the war or discouraging people from enlisting. Though Lincoln's actions were retroactively dubbed legal by Congress, they were questionable in the moment. Arbitrarily asserting illegal powers during the war is a recurring thread in presidential history, as when FDR proclaimed a limited national emergency that would become unlimited and allow him to intern tens of thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II. But often, presidential behavior is more about systemic corruption or covering it up than any one crime. Like when James Buchanan, who likely bribed members of Congress into passing a law allowing slavery in Kansas, also tacitly allowed corruption to permeate his administration while aggressively resisting any congressional investigation. Or when Ulysses S. Grant forced the Secretary of the Treasury, Benjamin Bristow, to resign after the bureaucrat uncovered a scandal that saw over 100 members of Grant's administration running a whiskey ring scheme to drain the government of millions of tax dollars. The short of it is, something about being president seems to make you exempt from following certain laws, and also seems to create systems where government resources are leveraged to protect you when you do. So what is it about being president that's so conducive to sketchy behavior? The reason presidents often violate laws is, according to political scientist William G. Howell, the job lends itself to living in a constant state of seeking ever more power because 1, the Constitution gives the president a select few vague powers to begin with, and 2, presidents are largely expected to deliver tangible results on nearly every domestic and international issue. As Howell puts it, vested with so few enumerated powers within the Constitution, but expected to deliver the nation from every conceivable threat, presidents are put in an impossible position. The result is a mismatch between the president's constitutional powers and the public's enormous expectations.
But it reminded many people of the limits of presidential power.
Howell goes on to say that the president's only hope, however tenuous, is to build their power, to read Article 2 powers in the most expansive way possible. He notes that presidents who choose not to behave this way are often decried as ineffective and relegated to the dustbins of history. The practice of trying to acquire power has, especially since the mid-20th century, meant blurring, reinterpreting, or just straight up ignoring the law. One example here is the rise of the Presidential Memorandum, a form of written presidential directive that tells federal agencies and employees what to do. Now, the memorandum came out of the post-World War II desire to consolidate military power under one centralized apparatus. Eager to avoid bureaucratic holdups, Truman started using National Security Council policy papers based on research or proposals across various agencies to craft actual policies. Now, as Howell writes, he was effectively transforming them from reports to the president into orders from the president. Kennedy renamed them National Security Action Memorandums and issued 272, expanding the idea of national security to include economic issues ranging from the Congolese diamond industry to sugar imports from Latin America. I think the important thing is just to remember that we're most safe when the economy is most good. Thus, memorandums became an effective way of insulating high-level decision-making from congressional or public oversight. This makes sense sense when you're doing something ultra top secret, but it also leads to all kinds of sketchy behavior. That includes Reagan's Iran-Contra scandal, which saw the president illegally arming Iran despite an ongoing arms embargo, and siphoning the profits to Nicaraguan rebel groups trying to do a coup. Once the scandal leaked, the NSC refused to declassify any directives, and the National Security Advisor, Colin Powell, elected not to testify for Congress. Because memorandums can be classified, we don't even know the full extent of how presidents are using these powers. And this is just one tool in their arsenal. In recent decades, presidents have kept up the tradition of ignoring laws, like Reagan's illegal refusal to spend billions of dollars allocated by Congress for housing subsidies, or when George W. refused to abide by restrictions laid out by Congress in the Patriot Act, or when his Office of Legal Counsel argued that Congress had no right to question the authority of the president when it came to interrogation techniques because the president, get ready for this one, is always deliberate, conscientious, and humane. Okay, so we all know that that's not true. Who is, always deliberate, conscientious, and humane? I feel like the actor Daniel Radcliffe. Now, this is hardly a partisan trend, as Obama used military force against Libya and airstrikes against ISIS without congressional approval, continuing a storied history since Truman of presidents unilaterally committing acts of war. There are also more subtle ways of helping presidents ignore the law, like fostering plausible deniability. It's a long-standing tradition that ramped up as the executive bureaucracy ballooned over the 20th century. First exploited by the CIA during Kennedy's presidency to facilitate things like assassination attempts against Castro, this approach has long allowed the president's subordinates to insulate the biggest kahuna from the most dubious behavior. This enabled the president to claim ignorance about everything from President Tyler's Secretary of State scheme to bribe newspaper editors to the CIA's support for many foreign coups. After Watergate, an extensive congressional investigation into abuses by the intelligence apparatus indicated that, as Frederick A. Schwartz and Aziz Hook argue, it is crystal clear that presidents, national security advisors, and other high executive branch officials knew of and exploited plausible deniability, excessive secrecy, the absence of checks and balances, and the use of fuzzy, open-ended authorizations were, as they are today, an invitation for excess and abuse. This didn't stop either, as evidenced by everything from assassination attempts on Saddam Hussein under George H.W. Bush and Clinton.
Our quarrel was not with them, but instead with their leadership, and above all with Saddam Hussein.
To Obama's administration wiretapping reporters. And it would be simple to boil all of this down to, the type of person that wants to be president is a power-hungry monster who doesn't mind breaking the law as long as it gains them more power, influence, and autonomy. A drunk is gonna go ham at an open bar, and a president is gonna break the law. It's not rocket science. But this ignores the fact that the office itself is grounded in a unique type of power, one which we can better understand through the theory of the sovereign, a term popularized in the 17th century by philosopher Thomas Hobbes. For Hobbes, societies necessitate a sovereign authority to avoid a chaotic and selfish state of nature. Now, to avoid this potentially violent situation, individuals sacrifice their own freedom and autonomy for the protection of a sovereign power. It's an agreement known as the social contract. This is also written about by people like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In the 20th century, German political theorist and Nazi Party member Carl Schmitt expanded on the idea of sovereignty, and particularly the way in which the sovereign leader creates a state of exception, meaning that they take advantage of a dangerous or turbulent time to expand their own powers while usually taking away powers and rights from others. Think George W. Bush after 9/11, or even Lincoln during the Civil War. Not one to waste time, the first line of Schmitt's political theology is, "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception," meaning that the sovereign leader has the power to decide when there are exceptions to the law. Often at times where there is a perceived risk, as Schmitt writes, the exception, which is not codified in the existing legal order, can at best be characterized as a case of extreme peril, a danger to the existence of the state, or the like. And this highlights the way in which the sovereign is both within the system of the law while also outside of it, empowered to make decisions on when and how the law can be suspended or altered. Schmitt writes, he decides whether there is an extreme emergency as well as what must be done to eliminate it. Although he stands outside the normally valid legal system, he nevertheless belongs to it. For it is he who must decide whether the Constitution needs to be suspended in its entirety. Basically, the one who represents the law is also the one able to remove themselves from obligation to the law in the name of protecting the rest of us. And as Schmidt argues, the exception reveals most dearly the essence of the state's authority. Now, for Schmidt, this exception is always connected to a particular figure, the one who uses their power to suspend the law. But Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben has taken this idea further, arguing that the exception doesn't describe the decision of a particular dictator or sovereign leader. Rather, it describes the nature of the law itself, meaning that the modern state and its accompanying sense of legality always already involves an exception. So it's not just that particular leaders take advantage of their power to create states of exception, but that the very existence of these positions are grounded in the exception. Agamben writes that the state of exception is not a dictatorship, but a space devoid of law, a zone of anonymity in which all legal determinations, and above all, the very distinction between public and private, are deactivated. So rather than being a space dependent on a relationship to the law, or even the original space from which law can emerge, Agamben thinks that the state of exception reveals a void at the heart of seemingly necessary systems, like government. And Agamben ties this logic to the American presidency, writing that because the sovereign power of the president is essentially grounded in the emergency linked to a state of war, over the course of the 20th century, the metaphor of war becomes an integral part of the presidential political vocabulary whenever decisions considered to be of vital importance are being imposed. And in his book, State of Exception, he uses examples like Lincoln, FDR, and George W. Bush post 9/11, among others, to describe this. Following Agamben, we could say that rather than an example of presidents always being assholes, or the Schmittian example of the sovereign deciding on the state of exception, the American presidency and its accompanying legal system is built upon an exception. Author Percy Sherwood puts it like this: Agamben asserts the paradoxical position that the state of exception no longer resembles the exception to the rule in contemporary governance. Rather, the exception increasingly resembles the rule itself. And according to Adam Kotsko, the exception is not a matter of entering a sphere outside the law so much as establishing law's applicability in general. That is, of creating a space within which the supposedly normal operation of law can be carried out. Which brings us back to the guy best known for shattering norms.
They say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
Now, under Agamben's framework, treating Trump's conviction as a shocking exception to the rule of law obscures the fact that the system of law underlying the presidency is grounded in an exception. So the president and the government they represent will always be able to step outside of what we might think of as the normal law. So when we say the president broke the law, we're kind of missing the point, as the law as such is grounded in an exception that at bottom has no real purpose or natural necessity. In other words, it's turtles all the way down. We might then wonder, is this just all there is? Are we stuck in a system where a state of exception means the governments and leaders can just step outside the law and do whatever they want, exempting themselves from legality while often exempting some of us from the guarantee of human rights? Well, within the system as it stands, honestly, mostly yet. But building on the work of Walter Benjamin, Agamben does see a potential for a messianic future in which the state of exception isn't abolished, but instead is made absolutely explicit. If currently the state of exception is hidden beneath the apparent meaning and moral necessity of presidents and governments, to make the state of exception explicit is to move beyond that fantasy and acknowledge the meaninglessness at the heart of these systems. According to Signe Larsson, the task for political action in contemporary society, the task of the Messiah, is not to challenge a law with a concrete content which we might want to change. The law that has to be challenged in contemporary society is the law of permanent state of exception. Larsson goes on to write that this is why Agamben believes that the state of exception in which we now live can be transgressed only by an even more radical state of exception. The state of exception where the law is returned to its originary meaninglessness, to a medley of letter without any order. So how might this help us make better sense of Trump's conviction and the history of presidents who get off on breaking the law? It shows us that Trump and his law-breaking predecessors are not exceptions to the rule of law. Their authority and very position is already grounded in the logic of exception. And this state of exception has slowly transitioned from aberration to normality. As Sherwood writes, over 15 years after 9/11, the state of exception no longer resembles the exception to the rule, but increasingly resembles the rule itself.
Russia, please, if you can, get us Hillary Clinton's emails.
As we've seen since 9/11, presidents can jingoistically weaponize the fear of the other in order to deprive certain groups of human rights and further expand executive power.
Have been transferred to the United States Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay.
And this isn't a left or right issue, as all presidents have implicitly or explicitly utilized the logic of exception. So it's not as simple as just electing someone who says, I'm not going to do that. Don't worry, I'm the good one. But it is, at least according to Agamben, as simple as pushing this logic even further. And while it's scary to face the reality that the law itself is meaningless and that the exception goes all the way down, doing so creates the freedom to move forward and maybe even build something new. In the meantime, we can at least enjoy that it is, if nothing else, exceptionally funny that an American president got caught breaking the law by paying off an adult film actress who described their sexual encounter as brief. But what do you all think? Are we missing the forest for the trees when we obsess over Trump's conviction? Should we be asking much bigger questions about why presidents usually get away with breaking the law, or do we prefer to just keep believing in these guys because the alternative's too scary? Let me know what you think. Also, huge shout out to all of our patrons. Thank you. I appreciate you. If you want to support our channel directly and get a bunch of extras like videos early without ads, access to our Discord server, extra audio and video content, extra philosophy lessons from your guy, check it out. There's a link in the description. But thanks to all of you for being here, for watching, for liking, subscribing, for commenting. It all helps. I know like every channel says that, but we really mean it. And also, if you like coffee, we have a new coffee partner. They're not paying us to say this. We just partner with them. We get a little kickback if you order some. They're called Yes Please. It's delicious. There's a link in the description. You get 20% off if you order. Who doesn't need coffee when we're thinking about the collapse of legality? I don't know. But in the meantime, just take it easy. And I'll see you later.